Hey everyone, tonight we're traveling back to medieval times. Not to marvel at majestic castles or tales of chivalry, but to confront a brutal reality where a single scratch, spoiled food, or a wrong glance could mean your death. In that harsh world, daily life was defined by disease, filth, clogged streets, famine, and superstition lurking in every shadow. But before we step across time, smash that like button and subscribe if you crave raw historical journeys, and drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's incredible to watch our global fellowship grow. Now dim the lights, fire up a gentle fan for that soft hum, and let's ease into tonight's unforgiving medieval adventure together. Wearing the wrong colors could get you killed. Imagine stepping onto a dusty medieval road, the sun beating down on your shoulders, the distant clang of horses' hooves echoing against stone walls. You think you're blending in with merchants and pilgrims, but the deep, blood-red tunic you've chosen to wear is more than a fashion statement. It is a death warrant. In a world fractured by feuding lords and mercenary bands, color was language, and misreading it could cost your life. From the waning years of the Angevin Empire to the fractious streets of 14th century Florence, sumptuary laws and unofficial edicts strictly controlled who could wear what. A single misstep could mark you as a nobleman's ally or an enemy spy and provoke a hail of arrows or the swing of an executioner's axe. Consider the case of a wandering minstrel named Thomas, journeying from Leicester toward York in the year 1322. He carried little besides a lute and a bundle of clothes dyed with madder root until, in a forgotten village just south of Doncaster, guards loyal to Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, set up a checkpoint. Misreading Thomas's ruddy garb as Lancastrian allegiance, they demanded his identification. He protested that he served no lord and meant no harm, but their orders were absolute. Any man found wearing Lancaster red must be confiscated and detained. When Thomas could not produce a herald's token, the guards dragged him into the earthworks at dawn and executed him as a prisoner of war, a humble musician felled by the politics of dyes. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, rigid regulations governed cloth and trim. In England, under Edward III, statutes dictated that only peers of the realm could sport fur-lined edges or trimming in specific hues. The bright azure reserved for dukes, the emerald only for counts, the sable stripes for knights. To don such colors without proper rank was an affront to the order of society and a direct challenge to noble privilege. Merchants caught flaunting violet or purple, colors derived from rare Tyrian dye, could be fined, flogged, or worse, pulled from their carts and hanged for counterfeiting noble attire. In Italy, where competing city-states vied for dominance, the stakes were equally lethal. In Florence, during the bitter civil wars of the late 1300s, the ruling Black Guelphs enforced a strict code. Citizens and visitors alike had to stick to muted earth tones unless granted special permit for the party's white and black livery. A cloth merchant from Milan, who failed to scrub the crimson dye from his doublet before entering city gates, was seized, stripped, and branded on the cheek with the fleur-de-lis of a traitor. The brand marked him for life, a living cautionary tale to all who might think themselves clever enough to skirt the rules. Yet these edicts were not solely tools of social control. They served military purposes. Armies relied on heraldic colors to identify friend from foe in the chaos of battle. A knight's surcoat emblazoned with the gold fleur-de-lis of France, or the three lions of England, declared his allegiance and invited safe passage through skirmishes. Conversely, wearing the wrong livery could invite targeted assassination. During the 100 Years' War, a contingent of English longbowmen under Sir John Chandos patrolled the Loire Valley in green mantles trimmed with white. When a lone traveler in similar attire approached, they mistook him for an ally and beckoned him forward, only to realize too late he was a French spy insulated by a stolen cloak. They executed him on the spot and burned his documents, erasing proof of any bargain. The consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Town councils used color restrictions to control burgeoning populations and stifle dissent. In 1385, the city of Ghent instituted a decree forbidding any citizen from wearing silk in shades of vermilion or chartreuse, colors reserved for the magistrate's robes. A rebellious guildmaster caught in such finery during a tax revolt was hanged from the belfry as a grim spectacle, his silken doublet fluttering like a flag of insolence. Sumptuary laws also reflected deep anxieties about social order. In Castile, after a series of peasant uprisings in the 1470s, King Henry IV issued an edict reserving black woolen tunics for the nobility and forbidding commoners from wearing more than a single layer of cloth. The rebellion had shown that poverty and discontent could coalesce into violence, and by policing appearance, the crown sought to forestall solidarity among the lower classes. Those caught in forbidden blacks risked floggings, exile, or impalement, harsh reminders that even color carried the weight of political power. Yet for many, eluding these dictates became a desperate art. Dyers and tailors developed clandestine recipes to mimic precious hues with common materials: copperase for green, woad for blue, and feedsack dye for purple, hoping to pass under the watchful eye of patrols. Some travelers stiffened their seams with garlic to mask chemical odors, trading bites of their tunics like illicit passports through hostile territories. The risk was immense. If a guild enforcer discovered the ruse, he could drag you before a magistrate, and without noble witnesses to testify, the sentence was certain. When the gates finally barred you from one city and another, you learned that medieval life had little mercy for misread signals. Clothing in that era was not mere fabric, but a code of allegiance, class, and loyalty. To wear the wrong color was to misstate your identity in the harshest possible terms. In an age where political boundaries shifted with the seasons and mercenary captains held the power of life and death, dye choices could become as lethal as a sword stroke. So the next time you admire a medieval manuscript's vibrant palette, take a moment to remember that behind each lavish hue lay a choice that might just have saved or ended a life. Speaking to the wrong stranger was a death sentence. Travelers on the winding roads of medieval Europe moved like shadows at dusk, ears straining for the faintest whisper behind them. A casual greeting, a careless question, "Who leads this convoy?" could turn a fellow pilgrim into a herald of your doom. In an age when suspicion was currency, every word weighed heavy, and silence often proved the only passport through hostile lands. Your life depended on the gaps between syllables, on the questions you never asked, on the stories you never told. Along the Silk Road, caravans stretching for miles learned to guard their tongues as jealously as their gold. Under the watchful eyes of local warlords, a merchant's slip of the tongue could be spun into proof of espionage for rival empires. The Mongol guards at each checkpoint demanded concise answers: origin, destination, cargo. Yet they listened for hidden meanings, for tales that betrayed loyalties. One misstep in a single exchange might see you branded a spy, your caravan seized, your fate sealed beneath the remorseless desert sun. In the shadow of the Spanish Inquisition, even the streets of Toulouse and Seville echoed with paranoia. A whispered comment about recent atrocities in the New World, overheard in the marketplace, could land you before the grim tribunal. Accusations flowed like poisoned streams. He spoke ill of our holy church. She questioned His Majesty's decrees. Trials were swift. Torture was routine. Confession became a ticket to mercy, but it was a false promise. Mercy delayed often meant the rack followed by the stake. England's borderlands offered no refuge. In the lawless marches between England and Scotland, a chance conversation in a tavern might draw the attention of rival clans. Language betrayed origin, an accent marked friend or foe. If you spoke the wrong dialect, you stood accused of raiding villages or smuggling contraband. Clansmen moved in silent packs, watching every newcomer. To survive, you learned to echo local phrases, to hide the syllables that identified you as an outsider. Your silence became your shield. By the time of the Ottoman Empire, imperial roads crisscrossed Anatolia under the ever-present gaze of the Sipahi and the Akuncha. Travelers approaching caravanserais found guards who knew the range of every accent from Constantinople to Cairo. An ill-chosen greeting, a slip in pronunciation, could spark questions about secret missions for European courts. In vast, multilingual realms, the simple act of speaking carried the power to reveal or destroy, and every syllable danced on the knife's edge between hospitality and execution. In Renaissance Italy, city-states wove intricate webs of intelligence. Venice's spymasters kept dossiers on merchants, diplomats, and artists alike. At gates guarded by lantern light, a misplaced surname could trigger a search of possessions for coded letters. Merchants who thought their business important enough for diplomatic channels found themselves stripped of goods, their secrets laid bare on a wooden table beneath flickering torches. The Doge's rule was absolute. Suspicion alone was justification for ruin. Even in the American frontier, the principle held true. Strangers spoke warily. Settlers passing through native territories risked misunderstanding sacred customs or tribal alliances. In the wild plains of the Comanche and Sioux nations, a traveler's question about hunting grounds could be construed as reconnaissance. Guides moved like ghosts, never revealing more than necessary. When relations soured, the tip of an arrow answered questions better than a tongue. Across centuries and continents, the lesson remained. The wrong inquiry invited violence. Keeping one's story close to the chest was not paranoia, it was survival. Inquisitors, governors, warlords, and bandits alike exploited language as a weapon. Words became charges. Conversation became evidence. The art of silence was the art of life, a discipline learned by necessity on every perilous byway. Today, when we trace these paths on maps of stone and parchment, it is easy to romanticize the traveler's courage. But beneath the tales of exotic marketplaces and caravan oases lay an undercurrent of dread. Every step carried risk. Every exchange could precipitate an ambush. To speak freely was a luxury few could afford, and so they passed, ghosts among the living, their voices muted, their stories untold. In the final reckoning, history remembers the victors, the great armies, the empires built on conquest. But the quiet travelers, the ones who survived by the strength of their silence, left no monuments. Their legacy endures in the empty roads, in the wind's lament in the ruins. They taught us that sometimes the greatest power resides in the words we choose not to speak. Pilgrim badges acted as medieval passports. Imagine the chill of dawn breaking across a muddy road as a lone traveler laces his boots and cinches his cloak, casting a weary eye toward the distant silhouette of cathedral spires. He reaches beneath his garment to finger the small lead disc hanging from his neck, its surface stamped with the image of St. James striding towards Santiago. This humble badge, no larger than a man's palm, is his lifeline across the untamed expanse of medieval Europe. Without it, suspicion lurks at every crossroads. A whisper of highwaymen in the shadowed woods, distrustful guards at walled towns, the threat of prison for vagrancy. With it, he bears proof of purpose, a passport more potent than royal decree, conferring the status of pilgrim and the protection of Christendom itself. Long before passports and visas, the medieval world relied upon tangible tokens of identity and intent. When pilgrims set out for the Holy Land, Rome, or the shrine of St. James, they carried not only prayers but hope sewn into fabric and hammered into metal. Monasteries and cathedral workshops produced badges in vast quantities from soft lead alloy. These badges bore sacred imagery, crosses, saints, scallop shells, and served as souvenirs of divine presence. More than souvenirs, they were functional documents, a guarantee that the bearer had visited holy sites, having endured perils both spiritual and temporal, and thereby merited safe passage through jurisdictions often beset by war, famine, or feuding lords. City gates were the checkpoints of their age, manned by burly sentries more likely to suspect a stranger of banditry than piety. Show your badge of Jerusalem or Compostela, and you were recognized as one who had laid down coin and commitment at doorsteps of churches and shrines. You earned the goodwill of hospitalers in distant towns whose duty it was to house wayfarers in exchange for evidence of pilgrimage. That badge secured you a bed in monastic infirmaries, bread in almonries, and mercy in courts that might otherwise see you as a vagrant intruder. It was, in every sense, your passport to hospitality. Yet the promise of protection invited its own abuses. In bustling market towns and along the Via Francigena, enterprising forgers pounded out imitation badges, mimicking the crude imagery with varying success. Some were hastily cast, their iconography blurred, their edges rough. Others were so skillfully contrived that even keen-eyed officials struggled to distinguish holy tokens from counterfeit. The result, a tense dance of inspection and assertion. Pilgrims defended their badges with stories of distant chapels and miraculous healings. Guards scrutinized weight and markings, ever wary of impostors seeking charity or immunity they did not deserve. Beyond the perils of forgery lay the deeper spiritual symbolism embodied in the badge. Binding metal to flesh, the pilgrim bore an outward sign of inward transformation. Each stamped shell or saintly figure was a talisman against doubt, a reminder of the arduous path walked in penance or in pursuit of grace. In the damp chill of a French rain or beneath the searing sun of Provence, that badge hung over heart and lung and offered reassurance that the journey mattered, that fellow believers awaited at every way station. It was both shield and shackle, a marker of faith but also a heavy weight, evidence that one had committed body and purse to the unknown. The manufacture of badges became an industry unto itself. Pilgrim workshops sprang up in towns abutting great shrines. Lead was cheap, and the molds, carved from hardened clay or iron, were durable. By sketching saintly poses on wax and impressing them into mold halves, artisans could cast hundreds of badges in a day, each requiring only minimal polishing before sale. Pilgrims, often penniless upon arrival, bartered scraps of cloth or livestock for their badge, trading worldly possessions for the spiritual credentials they so desperately needed. In Rome alone, tens of thousands of pilgrims passed each year, their pockets brimming with badges destined for distant homes. When the black stains of rust or the brittle cracks of age marred a badge, a weary bearer might stand at a chapel door, offer a prayer, and receive a renewed token in exchange for alms. This ritual underscored the cyclical nature of pilgrimage, a constant renewal of faith through hardship, a physical act of devotion reflected in the rotation of badges across generations of travelers. In some locales, mass distributions of badges coincided with feast days, drawing multitudes into the sanctuary and transforming the streets into rivers of devotees bearing identical symbols, each one seeking pardon, protection, or purpose. The presence of a badge also served as a social adhesive, binding disparate travelers into a community of the road. In crowded hostelries, strangers became kin at the sight of a familiar scallop shell embossed upon lead. Stories flowed as freely as wine, each pilgrim recounting trials faced on the way, robberies averted, miracles witnessed, friendships forged in the crucible of shared direction. From the crumbling wayside crosses marking ancient battlefields to the majestic portals of Chartres and Canterbury, the pilgrim badge was the silent testimony of countless interwoven lives, each journey unique yet part of a greater tapestry. Over time, civic authorities recognized the dual power of badges to both empower and exploit. Some cities attempted to regulate their use, declaring that any bearer without a recognized badge was subject to detention and fine. Others taxed the sale of badges, funneling revenues into the maintenance of roads, bridges, and hospices. In deed and decree, the medieval badge evolved into a precursor of modern identification systems. Proof of identity, proof of intent, and proof of passage across borders defined by stone walls and shifting allegiances. As the centuries turned, the era of pilgrim badges waned under the pressures of iconoclasm, the Reformation, and the centralization of state power. Lead gave way to paper, and soldiers' passes took the place of saintly tokens. Yet the memory of badges endures in the very concept of a passport, an official record of journeys undertaken, a shield against the suspicion that haunts all who cross unknown thresholds. In every stamped visa and holographic seal today, one can trace a lineage to that humble lead disc, pressed by fire and prayer, into the soul of every pilgrim who dared to walk toward the sacred, trusting that a small piece of metal could stand between them and the terrors of the road. Whistling on the road was a sign of devilry. Travelers moving along moonlit paths in medieval Europe learned early that a careless whistle could cost you more than startled birds. It could mark you as consorting with spirits beyond mortal ken. In the rolling hills of Normandy and the dense forests of the Holy Roman Empire, local legend held that whistling on the road was a summons to demons lurking in the shadows. The act itself was thought to pierce the veil between the living world and the nether realms, calling forth specters that stirred only at sounds too strange to be born of nature. Monks who copied scripture by candlelight recorded accounts of wayward wayfarers who vanished after a single echoing whistle, never more than a faint breeze to answer in return. The peril was real. Villagers, in fear for their own souls, often beat or drove off any stranger foolish enough to break the silence of the night, convinced that merciless spirits would follow in their wake. By the 10th century, ecclesiastical authorities had intervened to quell what they deemed dangerous superstition, yet the church's own sermons sometimes reinforced the taboo. Preachers spoke of whistling as akin to blasphemy, likening its sharp notes to the shriek of demons themselves. In illuminated manuscripts, marginalia depicted hooded figures holding their hands to ears or grimacing at small, bird-like imps emerging from a traveler's lips. These images left no doubt. Whistling invited more than misfortune. It invited damnation. In 1023, a synod at Rouen decreed that any who by gesture or sound beckon the Lord's enemies shall be shunned and corrected, implicitly warning that whistling was a summons not only to the devil's minions, but also to local militia who enforced moral order with clubs and ropes. Along pilgrimage routes to Compostela and Rome, the stakes could be even higher. Religious patrols, often armed monks or knightly orders, patrolled the byways after dusk. Their sworn duty was to guard the sanctity of travelers' souls as surely as their bodies. A whistle, echoed down a silent Roman road, might be interpreted as a covert signal from heretics plotting to waylay entire pilgrim caravans. Reports from the mid-12th century recount a band of Templar brothers ambushing a pair of whistling pilgrims near the Apennines, only to discover at dawn that the men were innocent merchants who had merely forgotten the gravity of local customs. The merchants survived, but their lamentations of bruises and broken bones spread rapidly, serving as cautionary tales for any who might test the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. In Eastern Europe and Russia, travelers believed their whistles would attract the attention of rusalki, vengeful spirits of women lost to lonely deaths in rivers and marshes. A single plaintive whistle at twilight was said to draw these water-borne phantoms noise from beneath the surface, where they floated unseen until they could seize a living soul to replace their own. In 1286, a merchant caravan recorded in the Novgorod Chronicles suffered the disappearance of a young apprentice who had whistled for a stray dog. Though companions called his name until dawn, only a tuft of his cloak, tangled in reeds, was ever found. The caravan abandoned its wares and fled, convinced the marsh itself had swallowed their friend. Further south in the nascent Ottoman realms, Arabic and Turkish travelers warned against the practice in their own lore. Jinn, rendered in desert tales as shape-shifting spirits both benevolent and malevolent, were equally drawn by whistling, a sound that pierced the oppressive silence of dunes with an otherworldly resonance. Caravans crossing Anatolia's salt flats carried talismans inscribed with Quranic verses or to ward off jinns summoned by unwary whistles. In 1321, Ibn Battuta encountered nomads near Konya who refused to speak, laugh, or whistle for 3 nights after a deadly sandstorm, believing that any stray sound would call down vengeful spirits to finish what the storm had begun. These beliefs also served practical ends. In a world where bandits and highwaymen preyed upon isolated travelers, the thunderous echo of a whistle could betray your position across miles of empty heath. Keeping silent became a matter of life and death, for fear of attracting not just demons, but human predators who listened keenly for the careless sound of movement. As late as the 16th century, Rosicrucian pamphlets warned that whistling in the countryside was a lifesaver in disguise. The whistle of an armed guard, echoing into hidden hollows, marked the approach of lawful authority rather than lurking evil. By the waning years of the Renaissance, rational travelers mocked these superstitions, yet the fear persisted among the common folk. Playwrights such as Shakespeare echoed the dread in their works, giving voice to characters who trembled at a whistle's ominous call beyond the castle walls. Even today, walking in the quiet lanes of rural France or the marshes of eastern England, one can feel the ghostly weight of centuries pressing on every footfall, and remember that sometimes silence itself is the keenest defense against the unknown. In retelling these tales, we glimpse the fragile boundary our ancestors drew between the world they knew and the one they feared. Whistling on a moonlit road was more than a careless habit. It was a deliberate act of summoning forces both feared and revered. And in that simple, piercing sound, they heard the voice of the abyss. Innkeepers could secretly rob or poison you. Imagine arriving at dusk, your limbs heavy with travel, the sky bleeding orange as you follow a narrow road toward the glow of lantern light. You push open the creaking door of a roadside inn, hoping warmth in a simple meal. Yet in medieval Europe, such humble shelters could conceal mortal danger. Inns were often unlicensed, run by desperate or unscrupulous hosts whose livelihood depended on the naive trust of passing strangers. Money was thin, law enforcement thinner, and rural roads bristled with opportunity for the unscrupulous. Records from English manorial courts describe villagers accusing innkeepers of lacing food with soporific herbs, deadly nightshade, hellebore, or hemlock. A mound of porridge might hide powdered seeds gathered from deadly plants, intended to weaken the traveler. While most victims sank into a stupor, only to awaken stripped of coin and valuables, some never stirred again. Chroniclers like the 12th century monk Matthew Paris lamented that a single cup of spice broth might be the last draft in a man's life, and courts sometimes fined or whipped innkeepers caught in such crimes, though punishment was irregular and often lenient. The motivations ran deeper than mere greed. Innkeeping required low overhead and few supplies, stale bread, cheap ale, and minimal beds. A proprietor could harvest more wealth by subtly drugging guests, waiting until deep sleep before rifling purses and pouches. Poisoning allowed a silent theft, no struggle to alarm neighbors or risk detection. In regions of the Holy Roman Empire, guild records from the 14th century stipulate that licensed hosts must provide safe lodging, yet unlicensed black inns proliferated along trade routes, exploiting the lack of centralized oversight. Outlaw bands sometimes colluded with innkeepers. Brigands would signal a rogue host using discreet signs, an inverted bucket, a burning torch at a certain angle, and after guests were dispatched to the cellar with a half pint of ale, raiders crept in. Some tales tell of secret trapdoors, leading to hidden vaults where bound and unconscious victims were dumped until morning. Peasants' testimonies before French seneschals recount waking in a ditch by a riverbank, possessions gone, clothing torn, with no recourse but to trudge onward, often perishing of exposure or violence. Beyond the physical theft, rumors of political or religious hostility added a darker hue. During times of sectarian tension, suspected heretics or rival pilgrims might be poisoned outright. A Hospitaller chronicle from 1327 references an inn near Messina where travelers arriving with the wrong scapular or token of pilgrimage were served a cup of wine sweetened with bitter aconite root. The act was both robbery and execution, a gruesome blend of economics and fanaticism. Scholars point to archaeological excavations of medieval inns in Germany that reveal concealed chambers and reinforced locks, suggesting hosts anticipated illicit activities. Written law tried to catch up. English assize of bread and ale statutes in the 13th century punished foul liquor, and an innkeeper's oath in some towns required swearing that no guest would leave worse than he arrived. Yet enforcement was sporadic, and many inns lay outside city walls where sheriff's writs held no sway. Travelers learned to beware. Pilgrims carried small flint and steel to test broths. If a spark changed color, it indicated toxic metals or plant poisons. Some smeared their cups with wax. If wax melted cleanly, the contents were safe. If colored residue remained, they withdrew. Guides warned of certain Highland inns where turning down a second helping of meat could mark a guest as a weakling unworthy of more care, or mark him for a fatal dose of herbs hidden beneath the stew's surface. Despite the risks, inns survived because travelers still needed rest and nourishment. Over time, regulations improved. By the late 15th century, many towns mandated licensing, standardized signage, and periodic inspections. But for centuries, the road remained a gamble. A single night's lodging might grant recovery or death, but either way, the innkeeper often prevailed. So next time you imagine the cozy warmth of an inn's hearth, recall the shadows behind the door. In medieval times, hospitality was a double-edged sword, where refuge and robbery, comfort and poison, rode on the same low beam and flickering candlelight. The wrong footwear could doom your journey. Imagine setting out before dawn, the sky still inked with stars and the air biting cold. You fasten your leather shoes, thin, cobbled together by a village cobbler from last season's scraps, and step onto the frost-hardened road. At first, each footfall echoes with promise. The road leads to holy sites, to distant fairs, to fortunes whispered in taverns miles away. But by mid-morning, the chill has seeped into your bones, and the leather, soaked through by dew, presses against your skin like a vice. You stumble, pain erupting along your Achilles, and you realize too late that in this world, shoes are not mere comfort. They are lifelines. In medieval Europe, travel was a gauntlet of hazards. Roads were little more than rutted tracks carved through forests and marshes, littered with rocks, brambles, and hidden puddles of ice. Footgear rarely exceeded a single layer of tanned hide. Soles were thin, heels absent, and stitching crude. Walk long enough and your feet would blister, a small bubble of fluid that, when burst, exposed raw flesh to the dirt and muck of the road. Infection followed swiftly. Swelling, fever, pus-filled wounds that turned every step into agony. Without antiseptics or proper bandaging, many a traveler perished not by sword or bandit's blade, but by the creeping rot of a broken skin. To survive, pilgrims and merchants improvised. Woolen strips were bound around toes and heels, serving as primitive insulation against frostbite during winter passages through mountain passes. These wrappings, soaked daily in vinegar or urine for rudimentary cleansing, provided scant protection but could not stave off every chill. In the Alps, record survives of a group of Genoese traders in 1253 who, trapped by a sudden snowstorm, tied sheepskin around their feet and pressed on until their blood froze in the cold. One by one they fell behind, unable to lift frozen limbs. By the time the storm cleared, searchers found only wolf tracks marking where the stragglers had collapsed, and no bodies to bury. Blisters, frostbite, and infection were common, but so was the danger of a simple misstep. Roads seldom ran straight. Mountain crossings entailed narrow ledges overlooking yawning drops. A traveler with foot pain might limp to the edge, misjudge his balance, and tumble to a death punctuated by the snap of bones against stone. Chronic foot injuries could turn wanderers into refugees. Unable to keep pace with their own wagon train or militia company, they were abandoned or forced to beg in roadside chapels. Even armies felt the consequences of poor footwear. In 1379, a contingent of English longbowmen marched from Calais to defend Brittany, braving muddy fields and river crossings. Their leather shoes, meant for English plains, cracked in the cold rains. By the time they reached Rennes, foot infections had incapacitated nearly a third of the unit. Their weakened state cost them at the Battle of Ponneville, where the French, better shod in hobnailed boots, maneuvered swiftly and cut down the limping archers. Chroniclers noted that for every arrow loosed, an English soldier bled from wounds inflicted by the terrain itself. The stakes were no less high for women and children traveling with caravans. In 1324, a merchant's wife named Elsbeth attempted the journey from Bruges to Paris, hoping to secure a silk contract. She wore soft shoes to protect her leather ankles. But the peddler who sold them to her had skimped on dye, leaving cracks where water seeped in. By day 3, her feet were raw, painful, and stiff. Each step sent hot spikes of pain up her legs. Despite tending her feet with lard and herb poultices, infection set in. When she finally hailed a passing cart, the driver refused to carry her farther, fearing disease. Elsbeth crawled into the nearest hospice, where she languished until spring, her dreams of silk and profit melted by a humble pair of shoes. Even in milder seasons, dust could be treacherous. Roads in southern France turned to fine red powder that clung to leather like glue. As travelers walked, the dust rubbed against their feet, forming calluses that eventually cracked open. A Genoese sailor bound for Marseille in 1297 returned with feet so battered he could barely stand. The ship's surgeon drained his sores daily, but blood poisoning set in. He died before the vessel docked. Some travelers tried wooden clogs, platforms made from a single carved plank. They kept feet above the mud, but offered no shock absorption. The constant jarring fractured arches and heels. Worse, when rain hit the wood, it became slick. Clogs slipped from stones or rotted in salt water, leaving wearers stranded barefoot. Yet for those who could spare the expense, clogs were better than nothing, a gamble between blisters and bone breaks. By the late 14th century, as trade increased and roads improved, specialized shoemakers emerged in towns and cities. But even then, quality varied. Tanners who knew how to treat hides for weather resistance were rare. Many cobblers relied on second-hand leather from discarded harnesses or tack. To spot a reliable pair, a traveler might look for soles spiked with metal studs, a luxury that cost the same as a cow. A peasant with such shoes was assumed a smuggler's accomplice or a knight in disguise. Both attracted the wrong sort of attention. In an age where travel was perilous, shoes were silent sentinels of survival. A good pair could mean the difference between reaching the next inn and ending your journey in a roadside ditch. They bore the harsh abuse of miles walked, the stinging cold of dawn's frost, the grinding dust of sun-baked paths. And yet, for most medieval travelers, shoes remained the poorest line of defense against a landscape eager to claim careless souls. So when you lace up your modern boots and zip closed a weatherproof gaiter, remember that once a humble shoe held your life in its soul. In medieval times, the wrong footwear could doom not just a foot, but an entire fate. Merchants used secret symbols to identify safe roads. Merchants who traversed the world's great trade routes carried more than silks, spices, and precious metals. They bore hidden messages etched into the landscape itself, secret symbols that spoke only to the initiated. These covert markings, carved into the bark of trees, scratched onto door frames, or inscribed upon roadside stones, formed an underground network of warnings and assurances. To the untrained eye, they were nothing more than scratches or weathered glyphs. To a merchant in the know, they were lifelines guiding safe passage through hostile territories. In the vast expanse of the Silk Road, caravans spanning 100 camels plodded relentlessly through desert sands and high mountain passes. Here, every oasis shimmered with promise, but could just as easily become a trap. The Mongol Empire, while famous for its tolerance of merchants, also harbored countless bandit bands preying on the unwary. Caravans bore secret signs. A diagonal slash over a rock meant danger ahead, perhaps an ambush at the next watering hole. A small circle beneath a thorn bush signified a potential safe haven, a hidden well and friendly faces. These symbols were agreed upon in advance within tight-knit merchant associations, passed down like family heirlooms of knowledge. One misinterpretation could leave a trader's caravan plundered, his goods stolen, even his life claimed beneath a relentless sun. Travel westward into medieval Europe, and the tradition of clandestine signage took on new guises. The Hanseatic League, that powerful coalition of northern German merchants, developed its own shorthand. A bident-like mark etched at the edge of a forest road signaled a toll-free path run by League allies. A double chevron on a toll house doorframe warned that local lords demanded exorbitant fees and that merchants should seek alternative routes. Guildmasters would carve these symbols under the cover of night, their apprentices carrying small chisels to discreetly update or remove signs as allegiances shifted. By dawn, only a trained eye could spot the fresh cuts hidden among centuries-old moss. In the hills of southern Italy during the Renaissance, merchant families competed fiercely for influence with papal and princely authorities. Secret symbols whispered of safe taverns in dusty villages where tax collectors turned a blind eye and where coin could buy both hospitality and discretion. Beneath the crook of an ancient olive tree, a simple spiral carved into the whitewashed bark indicated a covert meeting place where goods could change hands away from prying tax inspectors. A few strokes more meant an innkeeper was sympathetic to merchants, offering fresh horses and discreet stabling, critical information for those who risked highwaymen and corrupt officials alike. Further east, in the bazaars of the Ottoman Empire, tradesmen employed tiny etchings on door frames of caravanserais. A small crescent struck through with a single line meant the innkeeper would demand extra for foreign silver. Two parallel dashes suggested generous terms for exchange and storage. As the empire stretched from Anatolia to the Maghreb, symbols evolved regionally. In Anatolia, a spiral represented hospitality. In Syria, a stylized fish meant protection from local militias. Merchants learned to map these signs, transferring knowledge from one region to the next through coded notebooks, which survived hidden in locked chests for centuries. Even the Americas saw similar practices. In the early colonial period, Spanish galleons carried merchants along the coasts of South America, but pirates and privateers lurked. On rugged coastal trails, a simple arrow incised on a stone pointed toward friendly, indigenous settlements offering guides. A slash through that arrow meant the village had been taxed or was hostile. Traders passing through the Andean highlands relied on these hidden indicators, trusting them more than official guides whose loyalties might shift with the coins in their purse. The power of these secret symbols lay in their simplicity and adaptability. Unlike elaborate codes, they required only basic tools, chisels, knives, even sharp stones, and a shared understanding within merchant circles. Every symbol carried layers of meaning. One shape could convey safe passage, another offered water, yet another warned of recent bandit activity. They formed an information network older than postal systems, outrunning armies and transcending languages. As long as a merchant belonged to the right fellowship, he could read the world's margins and navigate perilous byways with a measure of confidence. Yet this network was fragile. A change in political power, a shift in alliances, or the betrayal of a single merchant could render symbols obsolete or worse, weaponize them against their users. There are recorded instances of rival guilds overriding each other's signs, erasing reassurances, carving false warnings to deter competition, or even marking a path as safe only to ambush trusting caravans. In such treacherous times, the greatest merchants combined vigilance with skepticism, cross-referencing symbols with oral reports and relying on secret emissaries to verify routes. As centralized states grew stronger and postal roads emerged under official control, the practice of etching symbols into trees and stones waned. Yet echoes remain in folklore and archaeology. Weather-worn carvings in remote ruins that scholars today debate, trying to decipher whether they were ancient waymarks or merely decorative. Modern historians credit these clandestine signs with saving countless lives and fortunes, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of ever-present danger. Imagine a lone trader in the 14th century clutching a leather pouch of silver coins, reaching a fork in a mountain pass. One path bears no markings, unknown perils. The other displays a faded rune beneath a twisted pine, a ring pierced by a line, the agreed symbol for safe passage into a friendly province. The trader hesitates, recalls the handwritten guide from his guild master, and steps onto the marked path. Somewhere ahead lie winding valleys and noble courts, but also the comforting promise of water, food, and protection from those sworn to uphold merchant rights. The decision carved in stone saved his life, and perhaps the livelihoods of all who followed. Today, when we marvel at the global networks that link continents, it's easy to overlook how merchants once navigated by hidden marks rather than maps. Their secret symbols vanished into moss and time, but the spirit of covert communication survives in modern equivalents. Encrypted messages, coded radio channels, secure trade agreements. Yet there is something elemental in those simple carvings, symbols born of necessity and shared trust, etched on living wood and cold rock, guiding traders through the shadows of a world where every road could be the last. River crossings were controlled by armed ferrymen. Imagine the dawn mist rising off a swollen river, its currents roiling like untamed beasts, and the silhouette of a simple flatboat comes into view, tethered to a rough-hewn jetty. A solitary ferryman stands at the prow, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over eyes that have learned to measure every stranger for danger and coin. He grips a long pole, its end shod in iron, ready to fend off more than drifting debris. As you step onto the wooden planks, you feel the weight of his gaze and the unspoken ledger of debts that hangs between you. For in medieval lands, rivers were not free thoroughfares but guarded frontiers, and each crossing demanded tribute paid in silver, livestock, or treasured wares. To refuse was to risk a violent fate, abandoned midstream, cast into the churning depths, or worse, flung angrily overboard when tolls went unpaid. Long before bridges spanned every river and kings decreed safe passage for merchants, ferrymen wielded near-sovereign authority over waterways. They were armed sentinels who patrolled their stretch of river like feudal gatekeepers, brandishing poleaxes or heavy clubs to enforce their demands. In regions where the flow was swift and treacherous, where undertows lurked beneath deceptively calm surfaces, Crossing without permission was not just taboo, but suicidal. Those who attempted to slip past clandestinely found boats drifted away, ropes cut, or were met by hidden allies who lay in wait on the opposite bank. The message was clear. Rivers belonged to those who controlled them, and that control was enforced by steel and by fear. These armed tollmen operated under local custom backed by feudal lords, who granted them exclusive rights in return for a share of revenues. Every crossing represented a small economy. Fishermen paid for license to haul nets across, merchants bartered spices or bolts of cloth, and peasants traded eggs or chickens. On market days, the ferry landing became a bustling scene of negotiation and intimidation. Bargaining voices clashed with the roar of the water, coins tinkled in wooden bowls, and on occasion, the heavy thud of a club striking a back that dared to haggle too long. Records from English manorial rolls record disputes over unpaid tolls, escalating into bloody brawls, sometimes ending in serious injury or death, with local reeves dragging offenders before manorial courts for restitution. Yet for all its brutality, the ferry was indispensable. Without it, roads dead-ended against water bars that no wagon could ford. Seasonal floods could transform a gentle stream into a barrier of swirling menace. In spring, when winter snows melted high in the mountains, ferrymen's income soared as travelers and merchants alike begged for passage. Inns near ferry landings thrived on transient traffic, and small chapels sprouted where wayfarers paid vows for safe crossings. In some stretches, ferries became so vital that they were granted immemorial status. Royal writs declared certain river passages inviolate, forbidding local lords from interfering, lest they anger crown authority. Even the church, which preached charity and assistance to pilgrims, recognized the necessity of river tolls to maintain boats and landing stages. Monastic ferry houses appeared along major pilgrimage routes, staffed by lay brothers who tended both spiritual needs and physical crossings. Pilgrims approaching such ferries carried tokens of blessing, a scallop shell or a simple cross, hoping to temper the ferryman's demand. Stories survive of kindly hermits who waived fees for devout travelers, only to be replaced by successors less moved by piety and more concerned with profit. The tension between mercy and money played out on every tributary, reflecting the complex weave of faith, survival, and commerce in medieval society. The toll itself varied by region and status. In some German principalities, coinage was the only accepted payment. In Eastern Europe, furs and grain were common. Nobles and clergy often enjoyed exemptions, provided they carried proper credentials. But those privileges invited resentment among common folk who labored under the same sun. Smugglers attempted to smuggle goods aboard in hidden compartments. Some tried to charm the ferryman with flattery or bribes, while others resorted to violence in desperate uprisings. Chroniclers recount raids on ferry landings during uprisings when rebel bands overpowered tollmen, set boats adrift, and declared free passage for all, only for order to be restored by mounted knights in a show of feudal might. When the toll was exacted, the ferryman's pole shoved against the muddy bank, and the boat lurched forward. The traveler felt the boundary of law and wilderness dissolve beneath him. The pale light filtered through oaken canopy, and distant church bells chimed, as if affirming that every coin paid here was a pilgrimage of its own, an acknowledgement that even the simplest crossing demanded sacrifice. At journey's end, riverbanks steeped in moss and scattered with driftwood bore silent witness to countless bargains struck in whispered fear and hopeful relief. As bridges rose and royal roads expanded, the age of the armed ferrymen receded, leaving behind only place names and fragments in legal codices. Yet the memory of those who traded iron for passage endures in our understanding of power and vulnerability. Each toll, each act of coercion, reminds us that borders are guarded not merely by statutes, but by those who stand at thresholds, weighing our worth in coin and resolve. In the silent negotiation between traveler and tollman, we glimpse the heartbeat of medieval life, raw, uncompromising, and bound forever to the ever-flowing river of history. Church bells marked safe hours for walking. Travelers in medieval Europe learned early to attune their journeys to the tolling of church bells that drifted across fields and villages like guardian voices on the wind. In every cathedral town, parish church, and humble chapel, the faithful rang bells at dawn, mid-morning, midday, vespers, and dusk, each peal drawing invisible lines of safety through the countryside. After nightfall or beyond these appointed hours, the paths fell under a shroud of suspicion. A wandering soul seen in shadows could be mistaken for a thief or worse. In the 11th century, churches multiplied like stars across Europe's tapestry. Benedictine abbeys, parish rectories, and pilgrim hospices all bore bells tuned to regional patterns. Every region developed its own rhythm. In some place, a single resonant stroke at dawn. In others, complex series at the 6th hour. Travelers memorize these sequences as one studies a map, counting each toll to estimate distance and time. A night journey on the Roman road network could begin only after vigil bells subsided, lest one risk the wrath of local watchmen who equated after-dark movement with sinister intent. Church councils codified the practice. In 1139, the Lateran Council decreed that travel after the hour of Compline should be discouraged, lest travelers be tempted into sin or criminality. Although the decree targeted clergy and pilgrims, secular lords seized upon its authority to regulate their domains. Some feudal lords imposed bylaws forbidding travel between Compline and Matins without special permits, a measure that both protected the roads and restricted movement. Violators caught wandering at forbidden hours were often subject to fines, corporal punishment, or summary detention. Pilgrims on the Way of St. James learned these rules quickly. Monastic guides handed out rudimentary itineraries, each noting safe stops, hospices, abbeys, and parishes that tolled bells to mark the night watches. The journey from Tours to Poitiers, for example, was divided by intervals measured not in leagues but in bell strokes. A traveler might hear 10 peals at Vézelay, then pace until the Praesidium bell at dusk. Straying from the sequence meant risk. Outlandish figures, from smugglers to ghostly specters, were said to stalk the roads after the final toll. In Central Europe, where forests grew thick and villages spaced far apart, the bell system became the unwritten law of the road. In the Bohemian March, an imperial edict of 1356 declared that any traveler reaching a settlement before none and after vespers must register with the vogt, the local bailiff, under penalty of losing their horse and possessions. Inns and toll houses kept their own small bells to synchronize with church time, placing them by the gates so a traveler could ring once and receive directions or lodging. Those bells saved lives by turning remote homesteads into temporary beacons of protection. These patterns continued into the late medieval period, long after some began to question the necessity. Renaissance scholars mocked the superstition. Petrarch lamented seeing Italian merchants constrain their movements to a campanological timetable, as if the peal of bells held dominion over body and soul. Yet common folk clung to the practice. The rhythm of bells was woven into daily life like breath. In rural France, as late as 1492, a parish register records peasants fined for lighting their fires after Compline, fined not merely for disobedience, but for disturbing the holy silence the bells enforced. When church bells rang, they served as audible landmarks, oral waypoints that transcended language and literacy. In a landscape pocked by dense woods, marshes, and lawless enclaves, those tolls built a network of trust. To travel without their guidance was an act of defiance, a gamble taken by masons, crusaders, and wanderers alike. And though modern roads are lit by lampposts and highways map our journeys, the echo of campanology remains, an ancient reminder that sometimes safety itself is measured in sound. In the Scottish Highlands, where winding passes and hidden glens bred clans and bandit crews, church bells were as crucial as sentries on the walls. A lone traveler venturing beyond the tolling of the 11th hour bell risked ambush by reivers, raiders who watched for isolated travelers after nightfall. Chroniclers from 1427 recount a priest whose faint journey home was saved only by catching the distant echo of Eildon Hill's chapel bells. He followed their guiding chime across moor and bracken, arriving at sanctuary with only minutes to spare. Even sovereigns recognized the power of bells. In 1306, Robert the Bruce ordered bells installed at key points along the route between Edinburgh and Stirling, ensuring royal envoys could traverse his kingdom under divine protection. Those tolls were heard as far north as the Firth of Forth, guiding messengers carrying missives that shaped the fate of nations. As night gave way to dawn, the first peal summoned not only clergy to prayer, but heralded a new day of travel. Bell by bell, hope was reborn on the road. In those tolls, ancient and unbroken, medieval Europe found a fragile order, proving that the safest paths were those guided by the sound of faith itself. Women disguised themselves as men to avoid assault. Imagine the damp chill of a pre-dawn mist enveloping a winding country lane, the only sound your own heartbeat and the soft rustle of wool against leather. In medieval Europe, roads were lifelines between distant towns, but they were also hunting grounds for brigands and predatory opportunists. For a solitary woman, the journey could mean harassment, robbery, or worse. To survive, many chose to conceal their sex entirely, stepping into borrowed identities under the flickering promise of torchlight. They traded the gentle curves of a woman's cloak for the straight lines of a man's surcoat, often several sizes too large, cinched low at the waist to mask shape. Long hair, once a symbol of femininity, was hacked away or bound tightly beneath a coif or simple hood. A pair of sturdy boots replaced delicate slippers, and a short dagger or cudgel completed the disguise, both for appearance and defense. In villages along pilgrimage routes, tavern keepers spoke of pilgrims in gray, whose voices lacked the high lilt of a lady's, and whose hands showed calluses earned by plow, or smith's hammer rather than lacework. Legal codes of the 13th and 14th centuries sometimes punished cross-dressing harshly, but in practice, the need for safe passage outweighed moral outrage. Chronicle entries from the English counties of Norfolk and Suffolk note women traveling under male aliases, sometimes even borrowing identity papers or badges of office to avoid the sexual violence that could accompany a lone female traveler. A record from a manorial court in 1324 recounts a woman brought by soldiers to a military post, dressed in a soldier's tunic, who claimed she was a boy from a neighboring village. Only when a local priest recognized her voice did the truth emerge, yet by then she had slipped through 3 toll gates without incident. Pilgrimage provided both cover and peril. Journeys to Santiago de Compostela or Rome attracted thousands of devout souls, but the influx of pilgrims also lured opportunists looking to rob the vulnerable. Female pilgrims often carried simple wooden badges depicting saints, but some traded these for official letters from monastic houses, granting them unchallenged passage through pilgrim hospices. To blend in, they mimicked the gait of male pilgrims. Long, even strides, head held level, eyes cast neutral. They kept silent, for speech could betray them. The tremor of a feminine voice, a misremembered masculine inflection. Despite precautions, one slip could be fatal. A sudden sneeze, a choking cough, or the frantic laughter at some private joke might draw attention. In a grove near Chartres, a disguised traveler was reported by a shepherd who thought her manner too soft and voice too meek for a man. He followed her steps until she reached a lonely hostel and then raised the alarm. Guards dragged her before the local seneschal, stripped her garments to confirm her sex, and delivered her to the local abbess for penance, though rumors persisted that her hosts quietly enriched themselves from the silver tucked in her pouch. Disguised women sometimes sought training in masculine comportment. They watched soldiers at camp, studied the way men held reins or flipped a coin, and practiced deep, steady breathing to steady their voice. Some carried scentless soaps and perfumes to mask the lighter fragrances expected of ladies. Others avoided crowded markets or taverns where a stray elbow or boisterous shout could expose them. Instead, they preferred forest tracks and lesser-known byways, guided by secret signs painted on fence posts by other travelers. The stakes of discovery were high. A woman revealed could be subject not only to robbery or assault, but also to charges of witchcraft or heresy, as cross-dressing was often conflated with moral deviance. A 15th century decree from a German town mandated public whipping for any woman found in male attire without just cause, yet offered no recourse for the predators who set the trap. In many places, local lords turned a blind eye to disguised travelers, provided they paid customary tolls, yet offered little protection when those hosts or bandits turned violent. Yet these women pressed on. They bore the weight of heavy cloaks, the sting of damp nights without proper shelter, all to claim the freedom of movement that men took for granted. Their silent footsteps on dusty roads became acts of defiance against a world that saw their bodies as property, their voices as invitations. Each journey told a story of courage and cunning, of lives lived on the edge between visibility and erasure. When you imagine a medieval road at dusk, think not only of the lone knight or the humble monk, but also of the woman who walked in a stranger's shoes. She carried more than a satchel of provisions. She bore the weight of necessity, the sharpened edge of fear, and the unyielding hope that dawn would find her alive. In those borrowed cloaks and clipped locks lay stories of survival written in the silent language of disguise. Travelers slept in churches to avoid bandits. Imagine the echoing creak of a heavy wooden door swinging open as dusk falls, and a weary traveler steps off a muddy road into the cool sanctuary of a stone church. The flicker of tallow candles casts long shadows across rough-hewn pews and cold flagstones, offering a promise of safety from the roving bands of brigands that haunt the byways. For countless pilgrims, merchants, and wanderers in medieval Europe, churches were more than places of worship. They were makeshift inns, sanctuaries granted by custom and canon law when no other refuge existed. Yet these sacred halls, filled with the scent of incense and the hush of prayer, were far from comfortable. They were drafty, cramped, and all too often preyed upon by the very outlaws they were meant to keep at bay. In the year 1154, a group of pilgrims bound for Santiago de Compostela arrived at the Abbey Church of Saint-Sauveur in what is now France. Their journey had already lasted weeks. Muddy shoes, ragged cloaks, and empty bellies marked their progress. When the gatekeeper lifted the portcullis and ushered them inside, the relief was immediate. Stone walls were thicker than hedgerows, and prayers louder than the crack of an axe. But the church was already crowded with 24 other travelers. Monks preparing for vespers, and a handful of local villagers seeking respite from a sudden storm. The pilgrims found a narrow strip of floor behind the choir stalls and laid down their scant blankets. All through the night, the wind whistled through fissures in the walls, and the stones drank the warmth of their bodies, but gave back only icy chill. No one at Saint-Sauveur expected a bed or a fire. Hospitality meant a warm bowl of pottage or a ladle of watered ale, if the monastery's stores allowed. Instead, most slept in their traveling cloaks, curled on the unforgiving stone. The discomfort bred vulnerability. When the church bells tolled at midnight, they doubled as signals for holy hours of prayer. But to traveling thieves, they were cover for predation. On more than one occasion, cloaked figures slipped between the columns, rifling through satchels and girdle pouches. The sanctity of sanctuary was a powerful deterrent in theory, but in practice, desperation and greed often overrode the fear of divine retribution. Monastic records from the early 13th century recall cases of belt knives and purses stolen under the pilgrim's blanket, never to be recovered. By the 14th century, as trade routes expanded and the number of itinerant merchants increased, churches in towns and villages became even more crowded. In London's Christchurch Priory in 1320, civic regulations attempted to limit the number of lay travelers bedding down in the nave after sunset. A clerk's memorandum warns that on certain market nights, as many as 80 men and women, some pilgrims, some vagabonds, slept between the arches and pillars. The air was thick with bodies, the snore of exhaustion, and the hushed prayers of those too weary to chant vigils. The ground itself seemed to bristle with fleas and lice. Footwear and stockings were removed to ease blisters, but in the damp chill they stiffened into cold, unforgiving shapes. Within hours, raw skin would blister again, turning every twitch and sleep into a jolt of pain. Sanctuary was supposed to protect from legal pursuit as well. A criminal seeking asylum could claim sanctuary by touching the altar rail and thus gain 40 days safety to negotiate surrender or escape. Yet the same doctrine that offered criminals protection also applied to traveling innocents. Townsfolk contested claims of sanctuary by vagrant thieves, and at times they marched en masse to church doors to demand justice. In 1378, records from the cathedral chapter at Canterbury describe a riot of local artisans who surrounded the church of St. Gregory, accusing a band of highwaymen of hiding among the pious travelers. Armed with clubs and torches, they stormed the porch, scattering women with infant swaddling cloths and seizing scabbards and coin purses. The subsequent trial exonerated many accused strangers, but condemned several townswomen who had aided the thieves, reminding all that even a church's shadow could conceal malice. Conditions inside the church were brutal. Winter saw frost creep through the seams of walls. The tall lancet windows, set high to keep out prying eyes, admitted only narrow shafts of moonlight and little warmth. Pilgrims burned tallow candles sparingly, for fear of scaring away the poor with smoke or depleting sacred stores. In the chapel of Notre Dame de Liesse, near Reims, a traveling troupe of jongleurs found themselves shivering through a blizzard in 1287. They huddled together in the transept, sharing fragments of bread and warming their hands over a small brazier brought for cooking, though open flame inside a wooden roof risked censure or worse. By dawn, 2 of their number suffered mild frostbite, and the brazier had charred the choir's oak paneling, earning them penance rather than hospitality. Even the clergy could turn predator. In some remote parishes, priests and sacristans resented the influx of outsiders, fearing plunder of church plate or loss of tithes to traveling preachers. Accounts survive of sacred vessels disappearing, replaced by chipped earthenware bowls, and of exultant clerical thefts of gold rings and reliquaries carried by the faithful. A particularly brazen incident at the Abbey of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire in 1241 saw a sacristan pocket a pilgrim's silver money belt, then accused the pilgrim of sacrilege when he complained. The monk invoked sanctuary to protect himself, and the traveler, shamed, fled the yard at dawn, penniless and alone. Yet despite these perils, sleeping in churches remained the travel custom of choice. Inns were scarce, tolls high, and brigands relentless. A lone traveler in the open, with only a campfire and a spider's web of stars for company, was an easy mark. Churches offered walls, if nothing else, and the faint hope that holiness might deter violence. In rural England, Domesday-era minsters opened their doors freely, and by the 13th century, a system of hospitium lodges attached to cathedrals provided designated sleeping chambers for pilgrims, for a small fee or a favor in prayer. When successful, these lodges elevated the welfare of the weary, a straw mattress, a quilt patchwork of donated cloth, and the constant murmur of chanting monks lulled many into rare, restful sleep. But even the hospicia could not guarantee safety. In 1364, a fire broke out in the hospitium of Chartres Cathedral, reportedly set by a pair of thieves attempting to flush out hidden treasure from locked chests. Flames leapt through the rafters, and non-combatant pilgrims had to escape through narrow windows, clutching their few belongings. The blaze destroyed linens, mattresses, and centuries of carved woodwork, evidence that even in a place dedicated to divine protection, human avarice could burn with lethal intensity. From the frost of northern abbeys to the dust-choked aisles of southern basilicas, medieval travelers faced a stark choice: risk the open road or brave the cold stone floors of churches. In either case, comfort was rare and danger constant. The sanctuary of holy walls was a fragile shield against the world's violence, often cracked by the very people ordained to uphold it. Yet for those who traverse continents, pilgrims seeking grace, merchants chasing profit, families fleeing war, the church remained the only refuge worthy of the name. And in that cramped, chill-lit space between pew and pulpit, they laid their burdens down, praying that the prayers of the night would carry them safely to dawn. You had to memorize every lord's territory. Travelers moving through the patchwork of medieval Europe carried entire kingdoms in their heads. Each region was defined by the banners that fluttered atop wooden palisades, the painted shields affixed to castle gates, the carved stones marking the entrance to a lord's domain. To trespass unknowingly was to invite suspicion, arrest, ransom, or worse. A knight riding south along the Roman roads would pause at every crossroad, scanning the sky for the silhouette of an eagle, a boar, or a rampant lion, each device declaring who held sway over the lands ahead. He might recall that the black eagle on a golden field signified the Holy Roman Emperor's lands, yet a twist of red beneath meant a rebellious duke had seized authority. Mistaking one for the other could see his party branded traitors, ambushed by mounted men-at-arms sworn to the rival banner. Merchants learned early that wares did not guarantee welcome. A linen trader from Flanders approaching the champagne fairs studied the coats of arms posted at every toll house. 2 golden chevrons on azure identified lands under the Count of Champagne, where merchants paid reasonable dues and inns offered safe lodgings. Beyond those markers lay the county of Bar, where arbitrary levies and violent extortion awaited unwary travelers. Guild caravans dispatched scouts to memorize the precise forms of heraldic devices and commit to memory who demanded coin and who offered free passage. Apprentice scribes copied miniatures of each emblem into pocket-sized codices, leather-bound and lockable, so that a glance at the fold of a cloak or the pennon of a guard flagged whether a party should halt, pay tribute, or turn back. Pilgrims on the way paths to Santiago de Compostela found their journey defined by heraldic waymarks. A scallop shell might point westward toward Galicia, but nearby a small carved shield showing 3 green piles signified the lands of the King of Navarre, where safe bridges and hospices awaited. In those borderlands, rival factions of Aragon and Navarre clashed, and forgetting whose pennant waved over the river crossing meant risking ambush. Pilgrims relied on local guides who knew not only the secret paths and hidden fords, but also the shifting loyalties of minor nobles who changed allegiances with the seasons. To these unlettered travelers, coats of arms were the language of survival. In the shifting borders of Brittany and Normandy, lords exploited ignorance. A lone wanderer paused before 2 castles perched on opposite hills. One flew a white cross marked by the uppity Duchess of Brittany, known for her hospitality. The other bore a black griffin of Robert of Mortain, brother of William the Conqueror, notorious for seizing livestock and free passage without mercy. Approaching the wrong gate earned him captivity until ransom or a pledge of service was paid. Stories abound of travelers chained to yew trees overnight, then released at dawn with torn garments and empty purses. Beyond Western Europe, in the fragmented Italian peninsula, heraldry became ever more intricate. City-states like Milan, Florence, Venice, and Siena each displayed complex coats of arms, combining ancient symbols and dynastic devices. A traveling scholar might identify the bisione of the Visconti family on a merchant's cart, signaling safe entry to Milan's markets. But if a rival family controlled the city that week, that same device painted atop the city's gates meant his research notes and precious manuscripts risked confiscation. Ambassadors carried small painted tablets as passports. Guards demanded to see the matching device on the castle wall before allowing entry. Without it, even learned men of the empire found themselves locked in stables or turned away at dawn. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista lent heraldry a martial edge. Shields bearing a golden fleur-de-lis told of lands still under Muslim taifas, where Christian pilgrims risked ambush. A red cross on white meant they had entered Christian-held territory, but one ruled by local lords who demanded tithes and testimonies of faith. A slip of recognition could see a pilgrim mistaken for a spy, interrogated under torture in secret dungeons. Many learned to identify the simple castle and lion quartered on the banners of Castile and Leon, assuring safe passage along the Camino. Yet even then, petty nobles carved their own signs into oak beams, misleading travelers into ambushes aimed at seizing horses and goods. In the eastern reaches, the Ottoman Tamar system defined lands by the standards of sipahis and agas. A white banner embroidered with 3 crescents signaled the Sultan's direct domain. A green pennant marked the territory of a powerful bey, whose tolerance of Christian or Jewish merchants varied wildly. Travelers memorized these signs to know whether they might lodge in a caravanserai without fear or need to bribe local officials. In Anatolia and the Balkans, the same symbol might appear in different colors to indicate shifting administration. So the traveler's memory had to be precise down to hue and pattern. The art of memorization became a discipline. Educated nobles used mnemonic devices, linking each coat of arms with a line of verse, a rhyme that recited the Lord's name, his demands, and his reputation. They practiced heraldic memory under tutors, reciting long lists of symbols before breakfast. For those without formal schooling, apprentices in merchant houses drilled one another in repeating the emblems by rote until the images burned themselves into the mind's eye. Night after night, they whispered the names of dukes, counts, and bishops, committing each to heart as if their lives depended on it, because they did. When war erupted, the stakes rose. Armies marched under familiar banners, but the lands behind them fell to displaced powers. A knight returning from the Crusades might find his estates claimed by a rival who had mastered the symbols of his house, forging a false pennon to seize his lands. Trials over rightful rule relied on proving control of heraldic devices over time. Memory of those symbols and their lawful use became the evidence that freed men from bonds or sentenced them to exile. Today, coats of arms survive in museums and stained glass windows. But for the medieval traveler, those colored shields and fluttering pennants were as vital as maps, as life-saving as water in the desert. They taught a global lesson, that knowledge of power's symbols is knowledge of power itself, and that to journey safely through lands ruled by infinitesimal fiefs, one must first map the invisible borders etched in heraldry. Silence could protect your words. Coins could bribe your way. But only memory of every lord's territory could guarantee that when you asked permission to pass, the answer would not be your last. Wolves stalked paths that crossed forests. Imagine the forest waking at the edge of dawn, pale light filtering through ancient oaks, their gnarled limbs draped in moss and shadow. A lone traveler steps onto the narrow track, boots muffled by damp leaf litter, heart quickening with each soft crackle beneath foot. Mist clings to the ground, swirling about twisted roots that twist like serpents. Somewhere ahead, a raven cries, and for a moment the stillness feels brittle, as though it might shatter under the weight of unseen eyes. In the medieval world, forests were not idle wilderness, but living cathedrals of mystery and menace. Domains where wolves roamed in packs, their amber eyes reflecting moonlight, their hunger sharpened by seasons of scarcity and by the lure of easy prey along lonely paths. From the Alps to the Ardennes, from the dense woodlands of Bohemia to the tangled copses of England, wolves were both symbol and terror. Chroniclers wrote of entire villages besieged by howling wolves that tore through flocks and drove peasants from fields. Kings and nobles issued decrees to hunt them, offering bounties for pelts and carcasses, and yet the forest depths remained their refuge. Travelers understood that to cross such lands was to invite an encounter with the wild. Cartographers might draw silver roads winning through green shading, but those shaded expanses marked more than trees. They marked territory of cunning predators that moved with silent coordination through thickets, using ancient trails aligned with watercourses and game movements. To journey by daylight offered some solace. Bells hung from saddlebows jangled with each hoofbeat, their irregular chime warning wolves of approaching company. Some travelers carried small torches, resinous pine knots bound with leather, to cast flickering amber light into underbrush. Others donned garments stitched with fragments of broken armor or jingling metal buckles to create a discordant symphony deterring silent fangs. But light and noise did not guarantee safety. In winter, when deep snow muffled sound, even bells seemed to vanish beneath drifts. Hollow deer tracks led astray through snow-laden glades, drawing travelers into ambush sites where wolves congregated to feast upon unwary prey. In medieval lore, wolves were agents of the devil, embodiments of dark hunger and unbridled ferocity. Church sermons warned parishioners that to ignore wolf warnings was to risk both body and soul. Yet peasants understood these beasts with pragmatic empathy. They watched wolves as skilled strategists learning from their pack hunting methods. Some communities maintained wolf dogs, large, shaggy canines raised to patrol village perimeters and warn of approaching danger. At forest edges, wooden pavilions called wolf lookouts sometimes stood, manned by sentries who rang bells or blew horn blasts at first sighting. These measures were part of an uneasy truce between man and beast, a mutual respect born from necessity. For the solitary pilgrim, the threat was more acute. Pilgrimage routes often crossed vast tracts of wood where inns were days apart. A pilgrim's staff was both walking aid and makeshift weapon. Hardened alder wood carved at one end into a crude spear point. Rivers offered potential escape, but crossings required ferrymen and tolls, and to delay risked entering forest shadows at the worst hour. Many carried small crosses and rosary beads, invoking Saint Francis of Assisi, patron of animals, to temper the wolf's bite. Legends tell of wolves kneeling before holy men, subdued by the power of prayer and sanctified presence, a reminder that faith too was armor for marrow-deep fear. Yet wolf attacks were neither rare nor frivolous tales. Medieval municipal records from Transylvania record cases of children and herdsmen killed or mauled during grazing seasons. In France's Vercors region, The beast of Gévaudan, legend of the 18th century, may lie beyond our medieval scope, but earlier accounts echo similar patterns. Packs emboldened by familiarity with human settlement, attacking in daylight, dragging off sheep and goats, and occasionally people. Lords organized wolf hunts as rites of public safety, mustering armed retinues on horseback, horns echoing across valleys as huntsmen drove packs toward concealed nets and sharpened stakes. These events were communal catharsis, both celebration of dominion over nature and grim acknowledgement of mortality's fragility. Travelers adapted tactics. In Italy's Apennines, mule trains formed moving circles, donkeys and mules braying to create confusion, while drivers kept hot coals at hand to hurl into brush if wolves approached. In northern Europe, some roads featured wolf pits, covered trenches baited with carrion, carefully camouflaged to trap unsuspecting predators. Though these pits claimed the lives of many wolves, they also claimed unwary animals, and occasionally livestock, and thus were used sparingly. The balance between eradication and preservation was delicate. Wolves kept forest ecosystems in check, controlling herbivore populations that otherwise devastated young saplings and undermined hunting interests of nobles. Thus, some foresters defended wolves as guardians of woodland health, even as they sympathized with victims of depredation. By night, the forest truly belonged to wolves. Travelers who dared camp beneath boughs found their horses restless, ears flicking at distant howls. Fires were maintained in shockingly small hearths, embers coaxed with pine twigs to avoid smoke blindness. Each rustle at the undergrowth made the heart pound as though preparing for war. In such moments, faith and fear intertwined. Whispered prayers mingled with memories of saints who tamed beasts, while steel knives were pressed tight against trembling fingers. Dawn's first rays brought relief, a ritual rebirth that consecrated both path and pilgrim. Today, we recall wolves in medieval forests as metaphors for unseen dangers and wild instincts lurking beneath ordered society. But for those who walked ancient roads, wolves were real adversaries and teachers, shaping strategies of survival and communal resilience. The medieval traveler learned that courage alone was scant protection. One needed respect for the forest's rhythms, ingenuity to outwit its predators, and humility to accept power beyond mortal control. Their stories, told by firesides and chronicled in annals, are testament to an age when travel was intimate with peril, and every step through wooded shadows was a negotiation with the timeless hunger of the wild. Every town had its own road tax and code. Travelers on the medieval roads quickly learned that no two toll houses were the same. In the stillness before dawn, a lone rider approaching the gates of Lincoln might find a wooden barrier lowered across the way, its attendant demanding 3 pence for passage into the town's liberties. While barely 50 miles to the east, at the gates of York, a riding merchant paid a silver groat, twice the sum under threat of confiscation. Each borough, manor, or ecclesiastical precinct held its own charter, its own code of fines and fees, and its own vision of who deserved safe transit and who was suspect. From the stone-paved streets of Paris to the dusty tracks of Galicia, road taxes operated under a dizzying array of names. Tabalano, Asimi Damis, pontage for timber bridges, pavage for road surfacing, mirage for town walls, and blandishments like passage dues levied by abbeys and priories protecting their lands. Those charters laid out not only the coin required, but the manner of collection. A toll keeper might weigh your cargo of wool bales, measure the head count of your oxen, or deduct levies by the length of your wagon's axle. Exemptions varied too. Clergy traveling between dioceses often presented letters of safe conduct, while pilgrims on official routes waved papal bulls to bypass fees entirely. Though petty officials sometimes quibbled over the document's seals. In the free cities of northern Italy, merchants faced yet another labyrinth. Florence might demand 2 soldini per barrel of oil. A week's travel down the road, Siena imposed 3 for the same commodity, plus a separate tariff for letting carts roll over its bridge. Venetian envoys sternly reminded traders that failure to pay the Rialto toll risked not only imprisonment, but the auctioning of both goods and beasts to cover the city's greater glory and necessity. When a Genoese merchant accidentally bypassed the customs post at the Oak Gate outside Lucca, he returned to find his mule hobbled and his ledger confiscated until he paid double the original fee. Within the patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire, the situation grew more complex. Imperial roads, managed by burgraves or castellans, coexisted uneasily with the staple rights of Hanseatic League towns along the Baltic. A barge laden with grain reaching Lübeck paid an imperial ducat for river passage, then paused under the city walls to settle the local octroi. Elsewhere, the emperor's missi dominati, royal envoys, traveled toll-free, their presence enforced by the threat of excommunication. Commoners and lesser nobility had no such privilege. A knight's squire caught skirting a bridge toll in Thuringia lost his mount and was bound in chains until the Lord's Chamberlain deemed his apology sufficient. On the roads of France, the capricious whims of seigneurial lords often overrode any semblance of uniform law. One marcher might impose a commons toll for each swine driven to market, while his neighbor demanded payment by the cartwheel. Peasants transporting their own grain to the royal granary at Provins learned to pay both the king's gabelle and the local steward's commutation fee, lest their sacks be thrown to the ground and their horses pressed into the lord's plow. Town walls bristling with arrow slits and guard towers belied a single truth. Those who passed through without paying did so at the peril of armed watchmen who held orders to detain first and question later. Violation of these countless codes had swift, brutal consequences. Missing one toll might mean a fine 3 times its value, or the simple loss of your horse and cart, auctioned off to satisfy the offended town's coffers. Imprisonment in a dank dungeon was common. Chroniclers recount merchants spending weeks in fetid cells beneath Rouen fortifications, their families forced to ransom them from debtors' prisons. In borderlands where Norman and Angevin claims overlapped, every 100 yards risked a new jurisdiction, a new feed, and a new guard ready to proclaim you a criminal for noncompliance. Yet these road taxes also knitted together shifting allegiances and emerging notions of sovereignty. Towns used toll revenue to build walls and pave roads. Lords maintained garrisons and funded courts. Kings claimed a share for royal expeditions or crusades. The very act of paying tolls affirmed the traveler's recognition of authority, a recognition that underpinned the fragile order of medieval Europe. When you pass beneath a gatehouse, coin in hand, you acknowledge the invisible lines of power drawn by hundred, shire, and diocese alike. In today's world of seamless highways and standardized fares, it is easy to forget that every mile once carried the risk of ruin. To journey safely required not only stamina and skill with a sword, but careful knowledge of every town's road tax and code. One wrong turn, one overlooked custom, and a sojourn could end in chains, or the lonely echo of a sold horse's hoofbeats as it vanished behind fortress walls. Travel in the Middle Ages was no mere matter of distance. It was an intricate dance with authority itself, performed one toll house at a time. Highwaymen used fake crosses to lure travelers. Imagine the soft glow of candlelight dancing on rough-hewn stone as you round a bend in a lonely wood. A simple wooden cross stands by the path, draped with a humble garland of dried flowers. Beneath it, a small basin of water glistens, and on a battered pew sits a figure in monk's robes, head bowed in solemn prayer. You slow your stride, weary from miles of travel, and step forward in reverence. Only when you kneel, chest heaving, do you hear muffled voices behind the shrine. Steel flashes in the torchlight. The cross was no sign of sanctuary, but a beacon for ambush. In medieval Europe, the Pilgrim's Road was a thread connecting cities and shrines, but it was also a tapestry of deception. Highwaymen learned that piety could cloak perfidy by erecting ersatz crosses at crossroads, often mimicking genuine roadside shrines blessed by local priests. They weaponized the traveler's faith. A passerby might pause to make the sign of the cross, bless a new day, or offer a prayer for safe passage. As hands folded and eyes closed, robbers slipped from the underbrush, cutting purses from belts and overturning pack saddles with merciless efficiency. Documents from the 13th century Abbey of Saint Denis lament the proliferation of such fake shrines along the main routes to Santiago de Compostela. Monastic records note that crosses painted with sacred imagery, saints' faces crudely rendered in ochre and charcoal, were indistinguishable at dusk from those sanctified in churchyards. Archbishop decrees in France attempted to regulate roadside devotional art, but enforcement lagged behind crime. In some cases, local bishops excommunicated anyone caught constructing or profiting from false shrines, but by then the highwaymen had melted into the forest, purses heavy with silver pennies and pilgrim badges. The trick extended beyond static symbols. Imposter monks became the next evolution in highwayman craft. Clad in patched woolen habits, they moved among travelers with practiced ease. They carried wooden bowls and begged for alms, feigning pain or blindness to draw in the compassionate. Once a small crowd gathered, fellow pilgrims offering coins or bread, the ruse shifted. A tilted censer's incense became cover for whispered signals. Hidden brigands slipped past trees, ringed the party, and descended with cudgels and daggers. Eyewitness accounts from a 1321 trial in Navarre describe victims who saw in that mendicant's eyes the flicker of malice once his hood fell. But such revelations were rare. Few survived to tell the tale. Highwaymen's mastery of religious iconography was no accident. Many were former quarrymen or soldiers who had fought in distant wars and returned with a warped understanding of piety and violence. They knew that a cross or a cloak carried immense persuasive power. By forging pilgrims' badges stamped with local saintly seals, they could pass themselves off as authorized hospitallers, guiding weary travelers toward hidden cuffs or muddy ditches. When victims sought to verify badges, fake hospices advertised by tattered flyers or crudely painted signs provided a deadly welcome. The geography of ambush shaped these deceptions. Narrow defiles and river fords, where travelers had to slow to navigate stones or water, were prime spots for installing crosses at knee height, low enough to trip a horse or snag a cloak. A statue of a saint might protrude from the hillside, beckoning a closer look. Beneath his pedestal, highwaymen carved niches to conceal themselves and their weapons. Local folklore spoke of a shrine to Saint Julian the Hospitable, located 3 leagues from Toulouse, that swallowed more souls than it saved, but continuing devotion made it difficult for authorities to remove the monument without offending the faithful. Travelers adapted. Some carried small iron nails, tapping on shrine wood to test for hidden cavities. Others observed the manner of construction. Genuine shrines bore chisel marks from skilled stonemasons, whereas fake ones were often crudely assembled with split logs and rough joins. Pilgrims learned to watch the weathering of paint. Sacred shrines maintained by local guilds displayed uniform chips and moss growth, while imposter crosses bore jarring contrasts of new and old wood. Church authorities tried to reclaim sanctity of the roads. Papal bulls in the 14th century blessed all roadside shrines under the protection of Rome, forbidding removal without express ecclesiastical permission. Local confraternities formed Watchers of the Way, groups of armed pilgrims who patrolled known hazard zones carrying banners blessed by bishops. Yet even these escorts could be bribed or corrupted. Records from the borderlands of Asturias tell of a confraternity captain who sold passage tokens to highwaymen, ensuring they were spared on certain nights in exchange for a share of the loot. By the late 15th century, as centralized monarchies gained strength, toll roads with formal checkpoints reduced the need for isolated inns and way stations. Uniformed constables patrolled bridges, and weighted measures at chapel doors detected hidden valuables. The rise of printing spread news of notorious false shrines, with woodcut pamphlets warning pilgrims to avoid 3 specific crosses outside Orleans. Their images circulated across Europe. Yet the cunning of the highwayman persisted. Even marked shrines could be sabotaged by removing official plaques or replacing them with near-perfect forgeries. Despite the dangers, the lure of pilgrimage remained strong. The risk of ambush was woven into the act of faith. Each step toward a distant shrine was a wager with fate. The highwayman's fake cross served as a grim reminder that symbols must be held with wary reverence, and that human hearts, like hearts of oak, can harbor both piety and perfidy. When you imagine the solitary highway at twilight, think not only of the wind in the leaves or the distant tolling of a chapel bell, but also of the wooden cross that beckons you forth. Under its shadow may lie sanctuary or betrayal. In medieval time, faith walked hand in hand with fear, and the narrow road was as much a trial of spirit as of body. Food poisoning was the most common cause of death. Imagine the sun climbing above the horizon as a band of weary travelers breaks camp beside a spring-fed stream. Their horses pick at tufts of grass while the men unwrap bits of hard, stale bread and gnaw on strips of salt pork so dense it could shatter a molar. They wash it down with watered vinegar, the only liquid guaranteed not to breed death in a leather flask. In medieval Europe, food was not a pleasure but a negotiation with mortality. And for those on the road, poisoning lurked behind every roadside stall and crude kitchen hearth. Long before dawn, worries stir among pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers alike. Will the meat pie from the innkeeper's cart be branded with the odor of decay? Will the unboiled pain bostege harbor dysentery that turns productive men into fevered specters? Vinegar was the traveler's salvation. Its acetic acid slowed bacterial growth. Its sour tang disguised the first hints of spoilage. A flask of pasca, the Roman-derived mixture of vinegar and water, remained on many a crusader's saddle, passed down generations for its reputed power to cleanse and preserve. Yet vinegar could only do so much. Under summer heat, even salted pork blackened with unseen toxins, and a single bite could unleash cramps, convulsions, and black vomit before the next sunrise. Consider the story of Anselm, a linen merchant journeying from Flanders to Florence in 1347. He chose salt pork cured with brine drawn from the North Sea and wrapped in coarse cloth soaked in wine vinegar. At a small tavern outside Dijon, he traded a handful of silver groschen for a meat pie proclaiming fresh venison. He bit into its brittle crust at supper, delighting in the flavor of what he believed to be noble game. By midnight, his insides churned. He stumbled into the tavern yard, retching blood and bile. Despite hurried prayers and poultices of Ruchameau and Angelica, he collapsed on the cobblestones, his final words accusing the baker of murder. When dawn's pale light revealed his still form, villagers shamed the tavern owner, but the truth of crime and chance blurred together. Was this venison tainted at slaughter, or had the baker refilled yesterday's moldy scraps? Across centuries, chronicles record similar tragedies. In the 13th century, a convoy of merchants carrying silks from Baghdad fell ill after feasting on dried mutton and flatbread under the Syrian sun. Dehydrated meat, cured with salt alone, fermented in the heat, breeding Clostridium botulinum, a toxin invisible to the eye. Within hours, men strangled by paralyzed throats or were felled by relentless spasms. Their camels continued on, laden with goods whose value far outlived their owners. Not just meat, but grain could betray its eater. Bread baked days earlier hardened into biscotti or zwieback, carried for endurance. But stale loaves, stored in barrels and subject to damp cellar air, invited ergot fungus. Consuming a single ergotized crust could spark convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene of the limbs. Known as St. Anthony's fire, ergotism left survivors crippled or mad, dragged to monastic hospitals to be bathed in holy water in hope of divine cure. Travelers often broke portions, toasted them over coals to kill spores, and soaked them in vinegar. The process reduced but did not eliminate the risk. Even fish, prized near coastal ports, became a silent enemy. Salt cod carried from Brittany to Bordeaux was sold by weight, salted thick and pressed into barrels that languished weeks before sale. A single barrel left unturned developed pockets of liquid brine where bacteria thrived. A basilisk of illness called dropsy would fill victims with water, turning ankles to balloons before the infection spread to the heart. To mitigate peril, many carried portable kitchens, a cauldron of iron, a handful of peat or charcoal, and a small bundle of herbs, rosemary, thyme, and pennyroyal, believed to have antimicrobial properties. Pilgrims on the way of St. James simmered broth from dried beans or split peas, adding vinegar to ward off putrefaction. A thin gruel, though meager, kept the body functioning. Those who dared meat did so only after boiling it thrice, once in fresh water, once in vinegar, and finally in a new broth, hoping ritual cleansing might purify flesh infected with foreign pathogens. Roadside inns were no safer. Public spittoons emptied into the hearth, ashes mixed with dirt to stoke fires. Pots simmered over open flames within stone walls that never fully warmed, their grease-blackened lids harboring insect larvae. Inns seldom prided themselves on cleanliness. Few could afford fresh honeycomb to glaze pots or citrus rinds to mask odor. A traveler might watch a grisly procession, the innkeeper pouring yesterday's stew into a pail for pigs, then using the same vessel for today's ration, an unbroken cycle of contamination. The pestilence traveled with armies. During Edward I's campaign in Wales in 1282, his soldiers subsisted on hardtack, salted beef, and vinegar water. The windswept camp churned bodies and refuse into the same mud. Dysentery raged through the ranks. More men succumbed to their own waste than to Welsh arrows. Chroniclers noted that soldiers carved their names on oak trees before death, a futile plea that their names be remembered even as their bellies betrayed them. In the absence of formal cookshops, women of traveling caravans became de facto apothecaries. They carried small leather pouches filled with ground ginger, mustard seed, and crushed garlic, potent spices thought to ward off gastrointestinal distress. A pinch of mustard in broth awakened numb stomachs. Ginger candies eased nausea. Yet these remedies were no guarantee. Poisoning moved too swiftly, its symptoms accelerating beyond the reach of poultice or prayer. The worst betrayal came from roadside pies. Bakers baked early, leaving unbaked centers within thick crusts that insulated warm filling until morning. Meat pies became death traps, boiling hot inside, cold and rancid at the edges. A single slice cut open in the dark revealed swarming maggots or slimy liquid. Travelers learned to tap crusts. An ominous hollow note meant danger. If crust sounded too firm, they broke it anyway, trusting risk over rumor, and sometimes survived, other times becoming another cautionary tale. In some regions, fear birthed regulation. By the late 14th century, town councils in Lombardy imposed fines on innkeepers whose meat pies killed customers. But tracking culpability in a world without forensics proved impossible. Innkeepers blamed spoiled lard from outside vendors. Butchers' guilds denied selling aged carcasses. Apothecaries excused herbs gone stale. Ultimately, no rule could halt the invisible killers that roamed across Europe's roads. Food poisoning claimed hit more travelers than bandits or beasts. It was the silent reaper in the underbelly of medieval life, turning simple necessity, bread and meat, into instruments of death. When a journey ended not at the gates of a city, but in a roadside grave, mourners rarely raised swords or stones. They whispered prayers, buried their dead without ceremony, and moved on, carrying vinegar and salt pork more for fear than for faith. So when you pause over your modern-packed lunch, sealed cheeses, vacuum-packed meats, sterilized water, remember that for centuries, every morsel risked murder. Travelers who dared step beyond home carried not just possessions, but the constant dread of what lay within their own rations. In an age before refrigerators, before microscopes, food poison did not discriminate. It turned bread, salt pork, and the humblest meat pie into a roll of dice with your life hanging on a single bite. Local customs could turn hospitality into offense. Traveling through distant lands, you learned that a single gesture could mean welcome or war. In the frozen fjords of Viking-era Scandinavia, a guest arriving at a longhouse was offered a horn of mead, its frothy brim a silent promise of alliance. To lift the vessel and drink in one long draught was to salute the host's honor. To sip cautiously was to whisper doubt at his generosity. Imagine the tension as you stand before the hearth's glow. The mead's honeyed warmth promising safety, yet your hesitation could brand you an untrustworthy stranger. One step from being cast out into the night's howl, or worse, driven through with an axe by an insulted warrior. Further south, among the chivalric courts of medieval France, hospitality took on a different dance. A guest was expected to wait as the host raised the goblet first, offering a solemn toast that bound both parties in mutual respect. To gulp the wine before the Lord's "À votre santé" was to seize the reins of hierarchy and insult the very feudal order that protected you. Knights and pilgrims who ignored this silent choreography found themselves facing cold stares at the table, whispered rumors among retainers, and at worst the host bailiff pressing his gauntlet into their back as they left, a pointed reminder that social order was as binding as any oath of fealty. Cross the sea to the Levant, and the rules shifted again. In the courtyards of the Abbasid Caliphate, A resident of Baghdad might offer tea with perfumed rose petals to a visiting merchant. The guest who refused a second cup risked being called miserly, his integrity questioned among the bazaars. A refusal could mark him as distrustful, a man of empty purse, and he might find his goods sold off by unscrupulous caravan partners. Yet to drink without pausing for the host's encouragement was to betray gluttony and disrespect for the art of serving. Each sip was measured, each cup offered twice, first to honor the guest's arrival, then to seal a bond of friendship that transcended language. In the Ottoman Empire's caravans, where traders from across 3 continents mingled, the silent rules of hospitality were carved into tradition. At a roadside caravanserai, a host would pour a small measure of coffee into a tulip-shaped cup. The guest must turn the cup 3 times clockwise, then counterclockwise, before raising it to his lips. This ritual ensured no grounds remained at the rim and honored the host's attention to detail. To neglect the rotation was to offend the subtle art of negotiation, suggesting carelessness that might seep into trade deals. A careless sip could lead to stony silence, and in the lawless stretches between caravanserais, a silent host was sometimes a dangerous one. In the courts of Tokugawa, Japan, protocols were even more exacting. A traveler invited to a tea ceremony entered on bended knee, bowing 4 times before kneeling to receive the bowl. The host presented the tea with both hands, a gesture of trust. The guest, in turn, rotated the bowl twice to hide its front, then sipped with eyes lowered. Each motion was steeped in centuries of courtesy and Zen discipline. A single misstep, a forgotten bow, an improper rotation, could humiliate the guest and render him unworthy of further hospitality. In extreme cases, rumor holds, a samurai host might see such a breach as cause to expel the offender, or, in darker tales, challenge him to duel for dishonor. Among the nomadic tribes of the Central Asian steppes, hospitality was a lifeline in vast emptiness. A yurta's threshold marked a sacred boundary. Cross it without untying your horse outside, and you challenge the host's autonomy. Offering food and a place by the fire, the host opened his life to you. A guest who refused the roasted mutton, or worse, complained of the saltiness, risked being labeled ungrateful. Yet to devour the food without praising its taste violated the unwritten covenant of praise and humility. Storytellers speak of travelers left to wander under the endless sky, their horses gone, their bellies empty, punished for ignoring the delicate balance of honor between host and guest. Even in early modern England, where inns lined the dusty turnpikes, local customs varied from county to county. In some shires, refusing the landlord's ale brought a frown and a hike in the nightly rate. In others, drinking before supper was thought uncivil, an affront to the family meal still cooking in the hearth. Innkeepers carved subtle marks on their beams, an X here, a circle there, to signal which customs applied. A traveler who failed to consult the host's nod at the door gambled on comfortable beds, only to find himself shivering on the hay-strewn floor, or chased from the inn by the innkeeper's sons. Across continents and centuries, these silent rules shaped the fates of those who walked unfamiliar roads. To master them was to navigate not only geography, but the intricate map of human honor. Historians tell of caravans rerouted through expedient dangers, deserts, bandits, fevers, rather than risk breach of protocol in a single hospitable hall. In letters home, merchants lamented that insulted hosts could close their doors forever, cutting off access to vital trade routes. Knights wrote of alliances dissolved by slighted drink. Pilgrims whispered of dungeons and ransom demands following a single misinterpreted gesture. Today, we may laugh at the minutiae of rotating cups or whispered bows. But for those who traveled before maps crisscrossed the globe, these customs were as critical as the stars overhead. Each region guarded its hospitality codes like a hidden treasure, passed down by elders and carved into memory. To the uninitiated, a gesture was only gesture. To the adept, it was a lifeline. And in a world where rumor and reputation held more sway than armies, the slightest misstep at a table could echo across miles, shaping fortunes and sealing destinies. So remember, in the silent spaces between words and gestures, the power to live or die was concealed, waiting for the traveler brave enough or foolish enough to ignore it. Disease spread best at traveler crossroads. Imagine the first light of dawn creeping across a dusty way station where dozens of travelers have gathered, drawn here by the promise of safety in numbers and the prospect of rest. The air is thick with the mingled scents of sweat, stale bread, and unwashed bodies. Worn pilgrims, caravans laden with spices and silks, and merchants from distant corners unload carts beside shallow troughs where animals drink. Fires sputter in rusty braziers as cooks stir pots of gruel. In one corner, a makeshift latrine overflows, its foul odors drifting toward the wooden benches where newcomers lean, seeking respite. Unseen by these weary souls, invisible agents of death move freely, carried from one person to the next, from one group to another, in the living arteries of medieval travel. In these crossroads, dysentery reigned as king of misery. Come spring and summer, when heat turned streams stagnant and latrines fouled the nearby water, a single infected pilgrim could seed a frenzy of sickness. Loose bowels became a torrent of contagion. Contaminating cups passed from hand to hand, tainting communal bowls of pottage. Men and women collapsed within days, racked by fever and delirium, their cries echoing off crude walls. Caravans once brimming with life thinned out as travelers succumbed one by one, stretching in the mud beside wagons until death claimed them in the night. Those left alive dragged bodies into shallow pits or abandoned them on the roadside, fearful that even the corpse might infect the living. But plague offered an even darker specter. Long before the great mortality of the mid-14th century, earlier outbreaks had swept through pilgrimage routes linking Jerusalem, Rome, and Compostela. Fleas, the silent vectors, rode within the folds of clothing and bedding, or in the rats that infest granaries and stables. When a merchant ship disembarked at Marseille, its goods carried the seeds of pestilence inland. From there, the disease leapt onto passing caravans bound for Lyon, Avignon, and beyond. Town criers barked warnings of black boils and swelling lymph nodes, but few heeded them until bodies piled in the streets. Travel hubs became nuptial sites of plague and commerce, where each handshake or shared morsel might mark the end of one life and the beginning of a series of funerals. Medieval healers, armed with the theories of humors and miasmas, struggled to explain these sudden deaths. They blamed bad air emanating from marshes or the alignment of planets. Some prescribed bloodletting or potent theriac mixtures as wardens against infection, while others recommended fumigating tents with burning rosemary and laurel. Pilgrims carried amulets inscribed with holy names or bits of bone from revered saints, hoping spiritual protection would shield them from corporeal illness. Yet faith proved scant defense against the microscopic invaders that slipped through every prayer and every charm. In response to repeated outbreaks, cities began to adopt radical measures. Venice, shaken by waves of plague in the 1370s, created the first lazaretto on an isolated island, forcing arriving sailors and merchants to wait 40 days, 40 giorni, before disembarking. Ragusa followed suit, erecting guarded quarantine stations where potentially infected travelers languished under guard, their supplies limited to stale bread and brackish water. These early isolation stations marked the birth of public health, an acknowledgement that travel and contagion were inseparable, and that restricting movement could save lives. Yet these measures came too late or were too unevenly enforced to halt the spread entirely. Even as land routes fell under regular patrol, the constant movement of pilgrims, crusaders, and itinerant traders kept disease alive. Monastic infirmaries, once bastions of hospitality, overflowed with the sick, and monks carved out mass graves beyond abbey walls. In the monastery's shadowed archives, scribes recorded with grim fascination the speed of death. A group of 30 leaving Cologne might number only 5 upon reaching Mainz. Local lords sometimes closed gates to arriving wagons, fearing the importation of sickness more than the disruption of commerce. The human stories behind these figures are chilling. A merchant's wife, bitten by fleas while inspecting cloth rolls, returned home to infect her entire household. A group of pilgrims traveling together stopped at a forest hermitage for shelter. By the next dawn, only the hermit remained alive, surrounded by bodies stiff and cold. In some accounts, families chose to bury their loved ones where they fell and press on, convinced that moving forward was preferable to waiting for death to claim them. Others abandoned belongings and fled, leaving roads littered with abandoned saddlebags and broken wagons. Despite the terror, travel persisted. The desire for trade, adventure, or spiritual fulfillment outweighed fear of contagion. Roads shifted like rivers, new roads carved through less traveled valleys. Fresh wells were dug, covered latrines built, and some enterprising taverners posted guards to disinfect rooms with vinegar and smoke. Guilds mandated that caravan masters carry basic medicines: poppy wine for pain, gentle purgatives for fever, wormwood infusions for dysentery, though efficacy remained uncertain. By the late medieval period, a provisional understanding of contagion emerged among some forward-thinking physicians. They noted that those who tended the sick often fell ill themselves, and that isolation conferred safety. But it was centuries before germ theory would offer a true explanation. In the meantime, the ebb and flow of travelers and disease continued its ancient dance, reshaping populations and economies. Entire villages emptied as transmission followed trade. Tax records reflect sudden drops in levies when death depleted human resources. Monasteries saw fewer offerings, for pilgrim traffic waned in seasons of pronounced fear. In the end, the story of disease at traveler crossroads is one of human resilience and vulnerability intertwined. It is a tale of monasteries and markets, of fetid latrines and holy relics, of desperate ingenuity and stubborn denial. Every caravan bell that rang in the morning called travelers onward, toward commerce, toward pilgrimage, toward unknown perils. And in that single bell toll, there lay both promise of new horizons and the unspoken threat of an invisible passenger whose one wish was to hitch a ride across the ancient veins of Europe. In understanding how disease shaped medieval travel, we glimpse both the fragility of life and the enduring courage of those who dared to journey, knowing that the road could bring salvation or the swiftest of deaths. Monks and hermits gave secret travel blessings. Winding your way along a mist-shrouded path in medieval Europe, you might suddenly glimpse a lone figure in tattered habit, a monk whose name you'll never learn, a hermit whose silence carries secrets older than kingdoms. These men of prayer and solitude were not mere eccentrics. They held a vital, if hidden, role in the silent choreography of travel. Though official hospices and abbeys offered lodgings by the roadside, it was the wandering ascetics who dispensed the real counsel. Spoken in hushed tones and cloaked in cryptic parable, their guidance could mean the difference between safe passage and ambush. Consider the Breton coastline in the early 12th century, where smugglers and pirates preyed on pilgrims bound for Santiago. Legend tells of Brother Elfric, whose gray beard trailed the ground like wisps of cloud. He would appear at dusk beside a ruined chapel, offering bread and water, and a veiled map traced in the sand. "Follow the gull's wing," he whispered, pointing toward a hidden inlet where supply ships slipped in by moonlight. Countless travelers credit him with saving their lives, though his footprints vanished with the tide. Further east, in the craggy passes of the Carpathians, hermits of St. Anthony's order eked out a life of solitude in wooden cells. These pustins, as locals called them, secretly relayed news of bandit hideouts in imperial patrols. A merchant caravan in 1274 records in its ledger a blessing received at the hermitage of Verochta, a carved talisman laced with prayers, hidden beneath the altar stone. In exchange, the merchants offered worn coins and the promise of a mass said in their name. Armed with that blessing and the hermit's whispered advice, they skirted a notorious outlaw stronghold at night, trading fear for faith. In the rugged hills of Andalusia, where Moorish raiders and Christian knights clashed, clandestine networks of friars served as covert guides. A Franciscan brother known only as El Peregrino earned his name by guiding fugitives and pilgrims alike through olive groves and rocky defiles. He used coded references to fish and fig trees. Where the fish sings at midnight, the road lies safe, to direct travelers away from patrols. When his identity was at risk, he slipped away into the hills, leaving behind only a scratched symbol on a waymarker, a simple staff and crozier woven together, signifying sanctuary to those who recognized it. Even within the great abbeys of Cluny and Monte Cassino, the official channels of hospitality concealed an unspoken alliance with wandering ascetics. Monastic scribes copied cryptic verses into travel manuals. Lines like, where the fox crosses the stream at dawn, take not the beaten path that echoed hermit's counsel. These marginalia offered encoded shortcuts, river fords shallow only during waning moons, shepherd trails that bypassed toll bridges, or shepherd's huts where a hot meal awaited the respectful wanderer. To oversleep chapel vigils and ignore these hints was to court danger, wolves, brigands, or worse. The power of these clandestine blessings lay in respect and reciprocity. A traveler who knelt to share his bread, whose hand touched the friar's staff with reverence, could receive a whispered prayer against ambush, or a finger-drawn sketch of a hidden pass. Many such encounters remain undocumented, preserved only in the faded memory of family lore. A mother's tale of her great-grandfather saved by a hermit sign, or a pilgrim's cryptic diary entry praising an unknown brother whose blessing turned fear into hope. By the late 14th century, as centralized authorities mapped roads and erected waymarkers, the hermit's role faded into legend. Yet travelers still spoke of secret blessings exchanged under the moon, of cryptic advice etched in scratchy ink on parchment scraps. In those fleeting moments beside campfires and crumbling shrines, they touched something deeper than geography. A living network of faith, compassion, and hidden knowledge that knit together a world of uncertainty. In recalling these tales, we revive the hushed voices of those holy wanderers, whose whispered warnings, encoded counsel guarded countless souls. Their blessings remind us that in an age of perilous roads, true safety often lay in respect, silence, and the secret wisdom of those who walked alone. Crossing a bridge without paying the saint's toll was risky. Imagine the weary traveler emerging from a mist-laden wood at dawn, the first pale light glinting off timber beams and the tangle of ropes that suspend a narrow bridge over a swollen river. In medieval Europe, rivers were both lifelines and barriers, routes of commerce, but also dangerous obstacles. To cross safely, one often had to acknowledge not only the toll collector's pouch, but the spiritual custodians said to dwell beneath the river's surface. Long before bishops and kings asserted authority over roads, local saints and their chapels claimed dominion over bridges. A small shrine, sometimes no more than a carved niche in the stonemason's parapet, was dedicated to the patron saint of travelers. St. Julian, St. Christopher, or regional figures like St. Eustace might hold court at a bridge's midpoint. Pilgrims and merchants believed that failing to toss a coin into the rushing water or mutter a Hail Mary risked the saint's ire. Medieval guidebooks warned that an unblessed crossing could bring sudden storms, fever, or misfortune on the road ahead. Records from 13th century England mention saints' tolls alongside royal levies. In Suffolk, a Lord Steward recorded payments not only to the man who tended the bridge's ropes, but to the friar charged with maintaining the tiny chapel at its entrance. The friar's stipend came from collected pennies, some slipped discreetly beneath a carved effigy's feet. Legal rolls show disputes when secular toll farmers tried to appropriate these coins. Townsfolk argued that the saint's portion was sacrosanct. Appeals to archbishops upheld that the coin for the bridge keeper and coin for the holy patron were inseparable if travelers hoped to proceed in safety. Superstition intertwined with insurance. A tossed coin was more than charity. It was a sacrament of protection. Chroniclers recount storms that split unblessed crossings, sweeping carts and horses into ice-cold depths. In Normandy, a trader who dared step past the shrine without offering fell ill with ague within days. His confession spoke of the water spirit's vengeance, but clergy attributed his malady to divine displeasure. In some regions, priests blessed each coin before it left an alms box, inscribing it with a cross or the saint's name. Such tokens, discovered by river anglers centuries later, bore witness to hundreds of rituals forgotten by time. Bridges themselves were sites of liminality. Stone arches spanned constant motion. Waters flow beneath, winds gust atop, travelers' footsteps across. To medieval minds, those thresholds required sacred sanction. A 15th century German treatise on road safety counseled never to cross after dark without invoking the saint by name. Terence, a Franciscan author, wrote that even a well-laid bridge could collapse if its guardian saint slept unentertained, awakened, perhaps, by the silence of an empty votive box. Yet the saint's toll was more than fear's currency. It was community glue. Villagers living near a bridge organized annual festivals, processing from the parish church to the bridge chapel, bearing banners and hymn books. They trimmed the altar boards and replaced wilted flowers woven into iron crosses. These rites renewed the saints' contract to protect all who passed. When masonry cracked or floods threatened, offerings rose. A sheep, a bushel of barley, even a lamb sacrificed in ritual before construction resumed. Economic necessity mingled with piety. Bridge upkeep was costly. Timber rotted, stone shifted, ropes frayed. Coin tosses funded repairs. Town councils petitioned bishops for indulgences to encourage donations. Pilgrims were promised remission of sins in exchange for a genuflection and a penny cast into the water. Papal bulls of the 14th century explicitly blessed such practices, declaring that he who honors the saint's bridge shall find safe crossing and road untroubled. But not all coin tossed was genuine devotion. Fraudsters sometimes left counterfeit pennies, their base metal glinting like silver in torchlight. If a coin failed to ring true when struck, some believed the saint would reject it, cursing the traveler nonetheless. In response, several dioceses outlawed foreign coinage at shrines, insisting only locally minted pennies, bearing a familiar cross, would appease the patron. The risk of skipping the saint's toll went beyond individual fears. Entire caravans sometimes refused to cross bridges without ritual, choosing fords or detours. Chroniclers of pilgrim routes to Compostela note that groups would halt at nightfall beside a toll bridge, starting fires, singing hymns, and passing around a single coin to ensure each person contributed before dawn. They believed that an unblessed crossing could not only imperil one life, but doom the entire company to hardship. By the 16th century, as centralized states gained ground, many bridge chapels fell into disuse. Toll rights consolidated under crown-appointed farmers, and the saints' portion merged into general revenue. Yet in remote hamlets, old ways lingered. Travelers in the Scottish Highlands recounted tossing coins for St. Kenneth at narrow wooden crossings well into the 17th century. In these places, the echoing plink of a coin still carried a prayer, reminding each passerby that faith and fear, sacrifice and sanctuary flowed together like the waters below. So when you picture a medieval road winding toward a bridge, remember that the smallest gesture, a copper coin slipping into dark water, was often the key to survival. In those times, faith was both remedy and right, and the saint's toll was written into every journey's promise of safe return. The path ahead might be long and treacherous, but with that humble offering, travelers dared to hope that angelic guardians watched from stone, their vigil rewarded by the gentle ripple of water beneath an attentive ski.